Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today on our webcast. My name is Dina Evans and I am the Marketing and Special Events Manager here at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. Today's presentation is part one in our CISO series on building successful threat intelligence programs. Today's session will focus on the business requirements piece. And your LookingGlass presenter for today's session is Alan Thompson, our Chief Technology Officer here at LookingGlass. Before we begin, I just want to run through a few quick housekeeping notes for the Bright Talk webinar platform in case you're not familiar. Please make sure that you note that you have tabs on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a chat feature on your viewer screen where if you want to submit any questions, please feel free to do so through that portal. Our audience members are all muted, so if you have questions, please be sure to enter them in your chat screen. We'll try to address all questions at the end of today's session, but if we happen to run out of time at the end, we'll still contact you at the end to make sure that we address your questions. And then also note, any questions submitted through that chat feature are only viewed by our presenters, not by fellow audience members. So if you have anything confidential or want anything addressed one-on-one, please be sure and note that, and we'll make sure to address it. Also, please note there's a section for attachments and links within your viewer screen. Feel free to peruse the items listed there. We've posted a few links to our threat intelligence services as well as our website and a few other features. But without any further delay, right now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Alan to kick off today's webcast. Alan?
Thanks, Dina. Hi, everyone. Appreciate you all taking the time to tune into this series. One of the things I wanted to, before we get into some of the details, I wanted to give some background on the motivation why we felt that it was good to present on this topic of Intel programs. You know, the industry, the security marketplace often publish a lot of content about various malware threats, etc. out there. And a lot of the content tends to be focused on the technical aspects of the malware, what vulnerabilities, for example, the malware may attack, what is the impact of that. But ultimately, a lot of time is spent on more technical aspects versus providing guidance on to organizations how to potentially both gather intelligence information themselves, but also potentially operationalize it in their environments. So we felt that having some insight on that topic of gathering data, aggregation, collection, analysis, and then refinement to operationalize threat intelligence effectively, we felt we had some good insights to share. And we appreciate the opportunity to share that with you. And so with that, we created this series. And we felt that it was an important and deep enough topic that we broke it into four key areas. The first area, which is the requirements, and we're going to cover that in today's session. The other parts are where we take the business requirements and the aspects of today's session and start to put together a framework of how you operationalize a threat intelligence program. And we'll give you some guidance on what that framework and what are the key aspects of that. And then we go into the details of, for different types of environment, different types of threat intelligence, etc., what are some of the details you should look at to build into a program or potentially leverage in a program. And then finally, in the fourth part, we talk about threat intelligence in action, and we give several very detailed examples on how operationalizing threat intelligence can be effective. So we felt that it was really important to kind of give you from business requirements all the way through to practical guidance. And so we're going to start with the business requirements. So the first thing I wanted to introduce around was, what do we refer to, or what do we mean by threat intelligence? This definition is on the screen right now, is a great definition by Gartner. And one of the key things I wanted to call out on this was around the term evidence-based knowledge. What does that mean? Evidence of what? And I think that is at the heart of threat intelligence. Data does not necessarily mean intelligence that can be acted upon. So the more that our operations and our security teams are aware that the threat intelligence provides evidence to inform decisions, the better decisions we can ultimately make. But it does not necessarily mean that one piece of data is something that can be acted on. It may be, but it may not be. And so therefore, establishing a program that allows you to gather as much evidence to support your other aspects of your security is critical to succeeding at threat intelligence. So how does that intelligence then manifest itself in downstream in other aspects of the security organization? Well, it definitely informs threat mitigation actions. It does not necessarily mean that all intelligence will be able to be acted on, but ultimately, the more evidence you have and the more accurate information you have, the more tangible a threat mitigation response is possible. But ultimately, threat mitigation leads to what a business term or the board level executives understand, which is about reducing risk. And that's one of the key things that we'll establish in this part of the series is talking about threat intelligence in terms of a C-level executive understands in terms of risk and justification of the program. So as you consider a threat intelligence program, many people may be aware of threat intelligence, but they may struggle with, well, how do I justify further investment, etc. So one of the first things that you should consider is really looking at how does threat intelligence solve a business risk problem, and how does it support or reduce the risk in that area. Many times, if you talk to someone and say, hey, we've seen this malware and we need to mitigate it, they may not understand how that relates to the operations of the business. They may not understand how that relates to various aspects that are unrelated to network technology per se. And the more a security team starts to be able to map that language between a technical aspect to a business aspect, the greater the chance that justification and investment in threat intel will occur. Another aspect of justification is around the costs of threat occurrences in their environment. So as breaches occur, if they occur, hopefully not too many, but if they occur, what is the cost of that? That ultimately does drive the justification for why you would want to invest in a threat intelligence program, and we can give more details in subsequent slides. The third part is really around justification is directly correlated with cost is also the impact of revenue of the organization. So if you're a for-profit organization, you obviously are trying to build a revenue and a successful model around building a business. And if a threat intelligence program is not successful, then your revenue may actually be directly impacted by threats and breaches occurring. And so we show how you can correlate those things together. The fourth aspect is that in most cases, many organizations do not have a greenfield security situation where you can just start from the ground up. Typically, you would have existing investments around security tools, and how does a threat intelligence program relate to those existing tools and are able to establish and build upon that rather than having to replace that. And so that's an important part of justifying investment in threat intelligence, is looking at how you can tie those things together. And then the final part of justification around threat intelligence program is around compliance or regulatory issues that maybe apply to your environment, your organization, or your sector. And we have some details on that, but it's obviously something that many companies are starting to pay attention to, particularly in the financial institutions and potentially healthcare, but it potentially impacts many organizations. So the first part of identifying the risk is what risk? And many security teams may be familiar with specific types of risks, for example, cyber attacks, cyber threat, technical vulnerabilities, but they may not be considering things like physical attacks. They may not be considering brand attacks. They may not be considering network infrastructure attacks that ultimately have a downstream impact on not just their networks, but also their ability to do business. And so the understanding the risk and correlating that to the justification of a threat interpol is really important. How complex the data and the data collection capabilities is ever increasing. So the challenge of gathering information, potentially it's getting harder and harder given that the volume of information is increasing, but also potentially the level of information that's available is also increasing. And for example, many organizations talk about being able to collect from the dark web and also from the surface web. Well, does your organization or your threat intel program have the sophistication and capability to actually be able to collect from those environments? Is that something you should be doing? And so be able to justify the reasons why you would want to be able to collect from those sources and the impact on the business if you were not, is a really important part of justifying a threat intel program. And one other point on this slide, which I want to call out, which we'll repeat throughout the deck, is around focus on your own environment versus third parties. As this Deloitte report suggests, many breaches potentially occur in third party or supply chain that ultimately may be used against your own organization. It may be a downstream impact, or it may be a direct pivot point to actually attack your environment. So being aware of not just your own network and your capabilities, but also being aware of the third parties that you rely on is an important part of a threat intel program. Now, one of the things that we show throughout this deck is various success stories to kind of help re-emphasize and to reiterate some of the key challenges that are faced by many organizations. And these are real-world examples. And this first one, we talk about a large energy company. And they had multiple sites, multiple staff throughout the world. They potentially faced risks from a variety of sources: terrorism, weather, cyber attacks. And that hopefully re-emphasizes that as you build out a threat intel program, it's not just about a security of the cyber aspects, it's also broader risk to the business. And so as a solution, this organization started by being aware of the global intelligence environment. So being aware of the threats to the energy industry itself, being aware of what is being communicated in that environment. They had a dedicated analyst team that was both language aware, but also able to do investigation on specific threat groups, potentially actors or terrorism that would potentially be either targeting them or have not been known to target similar companies. And getting in front of that threat allows them to take appropriate action. So again, the key point here is that risk to the business is not just a technical aspect, but also much broader than that. And the threat intelligence program needs to focus on the entire risk, not just one aspect. Now, if breach or a threat actually occurs in your environment, the cost is potentially significant. There are many well-known examples of costs, both in terms of direct costs as well as indirect costs. For direct costs, forensic analysis to understand the full impact of a breach, to understand how much data was stolen or what systems were actually affected and how they were affected, is potentially both a lengthy as well as involved process that somebody has to pay for. And that's often a direct cost in your organization. But there's also indirect costs which impact your organization around brand equity and reputation damage. And ultimately, it comes back to, as you consider how to justify investment in a threat intelligence program, consider these costs could be reduced if you avoided such breaches by having knowledge or information to avoid the actual breach in the first place. So as you consider justification into the threat intel program, make the case that some of these costs could be avoided. Now, is it always going to be 100% guaranteed? I don't think anybody in this industry could say that, honestly. But definitely, it's about risk reduction and building your case for why this still adds value. The example I have here from Brian Krebs on credit card breach at Kramer, again, is an obvious example where the brand is being significantly impacted by breaches. And I'm sure, the financial cost is not just necessarily in brand equity there. The second example of story is one that probably is sadly a little too familiar for many people in the organization or the environment, where someone is posting threatening remarks, content, targeting an organization. This specific example, it was a telephone company. The data to be collected obviously needed to be from where those people were posting, etc., potentially targeting either a company or an individual. The team and the company that responded to this were able to determine the credibility of the threat, the locality as much as best they could of that threat, and determined how realistic that threat was to the physical environment they were trying to protect. And the result was a much more broad impact than just the specific threat. Records and data and documents on policies were updated across the organization in multiple organization facilities, and a much greater stance to be able to respond to that type of threat going forward was achieved. A third aspect of justification threat intel program is around protecting revenue. The costs of a breach are obviously related, but the revenue may be impacted in real time as well. So for example, if you have a site or presence where you interact with customers directly and maybe they have payment systems on your site, if your site is the target of a DDoS attack or has been impacted by some malware that for whatever reason renders the site unusable, that has a direct impact on your revenue. So as you consider threat intelligence and how that program can actually benefit the organization, tie it to that revenue aspect as well. So making sure that executives who are buying into supporting a threat intel program understand that, hey, this actually has benefit to our bottom line will help build the case for that threat intel program. One of the examples on screen here where we, the FTSE in the UK find organizations billions of dollars obviously has an impact on those organizations' bottom line. And so the ability to make sure that you're both compliant to the best case or as near as possible is important to your bottom line. Next slide, apologize. So the next story, which is related to the financial industry, is where, again, we have a multi-international presence. That organization has both a CEO that's very visible, but also they have, in many locations, both physical, cyber, and reputational threats. And ultimately, they have multiple organizations with different concerns and priorities. So starting out, they focused on global intelligence to begin with, so understanding the worldwide financial cyber activity as a whole provided some level of awareness of what's going on in their industry. But then they have employed or stood up an ability to have 24/7 alerting on specific threats that potentially were going to be targeting them. And one of the examples was where actors may stand up mobile applications that look like the original application from the bank, but are actually fake and steal credentials that potentially that would then allow the actors to break into accounts and then steal money from those accounts. So the awareness of not just what brand and phishing was occurring, but also any applications that are being stood up in app stores that are fake was a key part of this organization's focus. To the other point when we talked about leveraging existing investment, one of the key things that people ask us is, well, what if I don't leverage threat intelligence or I don't leverage it effectively? How does that relate to my existing infrastructure or the tools that I've paid? a common tool that many people have in their environments is a SIM or an equivalent to a SIM. And typically it's a single pane of glass that brings together a lot of great data. However, it's a victim of its own success because oftentimes there's so much data and there's so much integrated into that single pane of glass that it's really hard for operations teams to determine what data is relevant or should be acted upon. And that's where threat intelligence with some level of modest investment can actually help that. And they can actually prioritize based on what threat intelligence is out there, cross-correlate it with the intelligence or the data alerts that are coming into the SIM. You can then start to determine what impacts you should act upon versus you can safely ignore. So threat intelligence really can be considered as a way of existing optimization of your investments and really doesn't necessarily replace those investments. It actually makes them more effective and useful. Now, this example success story is around a well-known one around healthcare. Sadly, healthcare again is a common target for people to try and steal PII information, etc. And this organization became aware of another organization in that sector that was breached, and they were wanted to be more proactive in response to that for their own organization. And so one of the things that they took a look at was how can we be more aware of lookalike domains and potentially being used as a vector in a spear phishing campaign against them. And they stood up a capability to monitor for those new domains being registered. Obviously, many domains can be set up, and so therefore there has to be some sort of form of refinement and analysis to determine which ones are lookalike versus ones that are not. The other aspect, the key challenge with this is that many organizations, especially larger ones, the security organization may not even be fully aware of legitimate sites being stood up. And so there needs to be additional processes in place to be able to determine which ones are legitimate and which ones are not. And so this team were able to build in that capability and also integrated the data feeds around threat intelligence, domains, etc., into their perimeter defense so that as lookalike domains occurred and they were vetted, they were able to be pushed to their perimeter defense to avoid the spear phishing attack succeeding. Now, the final area in terms of justification of a threat intel program is around compliance. One of the most recent ones published this year around New York financial services companies. I wanted to call out specifically one section of that document that talks about personnel and intelligence and the mandate that cybersecurity staff needs to be aware of current cyber threats and countermeasures or responses to those threats. I think that is just a perfect example of where organizations are starting to realize that the more aware you are of the intelligence that's available and the more you're able to provide that into your security response, the more effective your security posture will be. So being aware of those regulatory aspects that influence your organization is really important. But I would also give a call out that there are many recommendations, for example, in this document that apply to non-financial services companies. They apply more broadly. And so I would encourage people to take a look at it and educate yourself on how those aspects influence your threat intel. So the final example is similar to the healthcare one. This case, it was a hedge fund. They did already have a threat intel team that was monitoring domains. They did already have a complete awareness of their own network presence, i.e. they understood all of the points of presence that they were legitimate for their organization. And they were actively looking for lookalike domains that may be targeting a spear phishing campaign. And in this case, a report came out that identified a few lookalike domains. They were verified as likely target, useful for campaign. And they were pushed proactively to web gateways. And the employees in the organization as a whole were completely unaware of that attack being planned. and they were able to avoid that particular set of attacks coming from those domains. That doesn't necessarily mean that other domains would be stood up and attempted other attack vectors, but the key point was that they were more proactive, and that's where a threat intel program really helped them do that. So this survey recently in 2016 from ESG, one of the key questions that they asked the participants was, what are your objectives around a threat intel program? And one of the key messages from looking through the top answers is really about automation and refinement and an improvement in an existing environment. But with automation, you need to consider, well, how do I automate in my environment? So the key thing to consider is, do I have data and do I have enrichment capability to make sure that as I try to automate, the data I'm building on is highly valuable and highly accurate. So efficacy of data is vital if you want to automate your threat intel program. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you get rid of human beings, but it certainly means that you need to consider how to make them more effective. And so I think considering these aspects is an important part of looking at how to build effective threat intel program. Another aspect is the timeliness on the data. So if you receive threat intelligence that's, say, created a week or two ago or a month ago, then is that data still relevant to the threats that you're now facing or potentially facing? So timeliness of the intelligence is a valuable part of automation and integration with the security infrastructure. That doesn't mean to say necessarily that older intelligence is not valuable. It just means that it may be less valuable to be able to act on in mitigating new threats or active threats. The intelligence lifecycle is ultimately what we are driving towards in an intel program. And this is a very involved diagram, and it has a lot of details that we're obviously going to cover in subsequent parts of our series. But it really highlights the importance of driving from a clear set of requirements to data collection, refinement and vetting of that data, analysis, and then ultimately resultant intelligence that can then be acted upon. And you will note that it's not just about data, it's about the platforms and the tools and the people that are involved in that entire process. And that's where our framework, we are going to touch on all aspects of this. So we will talk about what do we need to do in terms of people and capability in that regard, what tools need to exist, or what are the typical types of tools that need to exist. What are the types of data that we need to collect, and what should we be looking for in the types of data? But this overall cycle is really important to understand, that it's not a one-time shop. It's not a, once you've collected some data, you're done. Threat intelligence is a continuously evolving and improving process of refinement and improvement of decisions. And as you engage in building out a threat intelligence program, you should really be considering it that way rather than you just buy it once and then you're done. It's really not that. So another aspect of the intelligence efforts in threat intel programs is, where should you start? As I said at the beginning, there are many people who already know threat intelligence somewhat, and they may be looking for prioritization. Some people might not even know really where they should start. So our recommendations is really around 3 phases. The first phase is look to a threat intel program to really focus on protecting your own assets, your own organization, not just the networks, but to the earlier point about a broad risk portfolio. Focus on those aspects. The second part is the third party in supply chain. Obviously, many organizations rely heavily on supply chain, and that's an area that you should take seriously and build out that capability in your program. And then finally, to the examples about where I was talking about the energy company and the financial institution that have broad coverage throughout the world, there may be indirect intelligence that may not have a direct correlation to an immediate threat, but being aware of something like that in either another industry that could potentially be pivoted or used against your industry, that's an aspect where being aware potentially can build out your capability better. Now, one of the things that we've done when we discuss this with organizations is how do we categorize third parties in our supply chain? There's many different maturity levels. There's many different accesses to your environment. So we have this simple 2x2 matrix where the one side is basically the maturity of the organization or the third-party organization. And then the other axis is based on the access they have to your networks and your systems. Now, the less mature organization may require an approach and a response in your threat intel program that is different than, say, a more mature organization. And certainly, an organization that has very detailed access to your networks, you may want to take a much more proactive and active defense model as part of the response and monitoring capabilities. So we will get into some of the details of this aspect in subsequent parts of our webinar series as well. But at a high level, start to think about, as you understand your threat intel program, what supply chain and third parties do you have concerns about, and which approach, which quadrant do they fit into, and this helps form the response. So some of the key recommendations. The first thing is you really need to build out the justification for the program. You need to consider the risk that you're addressing, and remember to keep it in terms of business risk, not just necessarily just a technical aspect. Relate it to the cost of threat if those occur, and show that how threat intel programs can actually potentially reduce cost. Show the investment savings and the value of existing investments by leveraging a threat intel program. Look at the impact on revenue, both if the revenue is protected or increased because of security, but also potentially how it's reduced if it's not taken seriously. And then finally, justify the program based on whatever regulatory compliance applies to your environment. And oftentimes, there's something in your environment. The second part of the key recommendations is define your program around the full life cycle of intelligence. So your program shouldn't just be about collecting some data. It should be looking at how do you take that data and refine it into intelligence that ultimately gets acted on and operationalized. So consider all of that aspect as part of your definition and refinement of the program. And then finally, look at yourself first, third party and supply chain second, and then the indirect intelligence in that order. You may pick and choose aspects of yourself as well as third party, initially, but the key thing is don't get overwhelmed by the volume of intelligence out there that may not even be applicable to your environment. So focus on the things that you believe are relevant to your environment. So with that, I wanted to kind of give a call out to our next webinar part before we get to the questions around. We will be discussing the program framework and starting to take a bigger dig into the program framework so that you can start really adjusting your environment for that. And with that, I will show the question slide, and Dina, I will hand it over to you for pick up any questions.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Yeah, there have been a few questions that have been starting to filter in. One I want to address first. There was a question about being able to share the slides, and yes, absolutely. We will send out a copy of the slides from today's presentation to the audience member after the webcast, to everyone within the audience. Let's see, okay, moving on, next question. Here's one for you, Alan. Do you think we should be concerned about threats targeting our supply chain or just focus on our own assets first?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. As I was just discussing in the prior slide, many people have been attacked via the third party or the supply chain as a way to get into their organization. I think there's several well-known examples that the industry are kind of tired of hearing, but the key point is they continue to be a factor. And so think about the bad actors and the actors who are trying to target you will look for what are your weak points. They will look to understand your networks, your aspects, and you may have a very robust security defense capability. And so they will then look to alternative approaches to potentially get into your environment. And so that's one of the reasons why, for example, spear phishing is so successful, is because the easiest path to get into an organization is sending a specifically crafted email to an individual who may be busy or not paying attention when they click on an attachment, and that then affects their system, and that is a way into the environment. So you absolutely should consider your own organization as number one, but do not ignore the third party. The third party in the supply chain is an important part of your overall threat intelligence program.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan. Here's another one that's come in. It says, let's see, if my organization has limited resources to handle threats, where would you recommend we start with threat intelligence?
So this is a very common situation. Most people are, frankly, overwhelmed with potentially the types of data that's available in the threat intelligence market or the threat data market. There's lots of vendors out there, promising a lot of things. So look at an incremental approach, first of all, and in your existing security posture, how could you complement that? And typically we've seen in many of our, organizations where just simply taking a highly accurate data feed and putting that into their security, their SIM, is a great way to start to leverage threat intelligence. The data itself is vetted, for example, by us, our analyst team. And so the data that we are pushing to a recipient in that regard is already, something that they don't have to necessarily post-analyze or determine its relevance to their environment. They just can say, okay, you guys have done your job and you've got a great feed here. I'm just going to leverage it. And that way they can get into leveraging threat intelligence without necessarily having to change everything that they've done themselves already. They can leverage existing investments, and that's a safe way to take a baby step. Now, I will say that, that is literally just a baby step. That may then open the Pandora's box, if you will, to, well, what else, what other data do I need to collect, and et cetera, et cetera. And so as you start to take these baby steps in threat intelligence, you need to start coming back to, which is one of the key recommendations, is what are your objectives of a threat intelligence program? What is the risk you're trying to reduce? And so those are things that ultimately a security vendor cannot necessarily define for you. We can certainly help you peel back the onion, if you will, and identify them. But ultimately, your business and what is at risk in your business and what are you trying to protect is something you have a responsibility to identify. And then we can work with you to kind of say, okay, this is where either a data feed can help, where an analysis capability that we have can complement your team. We have products that you can deploy in your network and potentially all of the above. So it really depends on your environment and your needs on where you start.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan. Okay, here's a couple more that have come in. I hope we can address both of them. We'll see. This one says, what recommendations do you have when considering different TI providers?
Well, I kind of touched on that in the previous answer, but I will repeat it just for the sake of clarity.
Right.
Threat intelligence is not just a piece of data. It also comes with an association of how accurate it is and how detailed it is to act upon. And so therefore, as you consider threat intelligence providers, do they provide you with just data? Do they actually have an analysis team that have actually vetted the data? Does the data itself even provide enough context to be able to act upon? Many data feed providers may just provide you with basic data without metadata, the associated context that supports what data they're providing. And so the greater the context that's provided, the more actionable it will be. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that the data has been checked for accuracy. So another aspect is, as you look at vendors who are providing data and intelligence, look at their processes and how they do their job. And many people will share that on not necessarily all of the details on where they get their information or some of that, but they will be open about, okay, here is our process, and here is how we gather the data, we make sure it's accurate. And as an organization that's considering potentially leveraging that threat intelligence, you have a right to kick the tires on that and really kind of make sure that the vendors that you're integrating with are mature and sophisticated in that capability.
Very good points. Here's one more. I think we've got a couple more minutes left, so let's go ahead and try to brief on this one. How do we go about assessing risk associated with our third parties in supply chain?
Yeah, great question. I think ultimately I would start by, again, putting supply chain and third parties in that quadrant and assessing, does this supply chain or vendor, do they have login credentials to my systems? Do I use systems that are connected to their systems that ultimately, if they were attacked, would that then allow access to our internal networks? So an assessment of the access to your environment is a good way to start. The second part is, if they're a mature organization, they should have their own security teams. They should have their own security threat intel program, their own policies. And you should be able to say, hey, who are the people that I can talk to in a case of an incident or a breach? And what are the processes that you take to secure your systems and your people to make sure that if you are compromised, does that ultimately lead to a compromise that potentially in my environment? So these are the types of things that are policy and questions, but ultimately you can actually defend also against it. So if they are not able to answer some of these questions, then that informs how you respond to that, that vendor. One choice is, okay, I'm not going to do business with that vendor. The other is that, well, I can't afford to not do business because there is no alternative, and so therefore I need to take potentially a more proactive approach to monitoring and gathering data on their systems so that if a compromise occurs, then I'm aware of it and able to respond quickly.
Okay. I think we're almost out of time, Alan. So in closing, definitely, Alan, thank you for today's presentation. Thank you to everyone who's attended today's live webcast from LookingGlass. A recording of our today's webinar will be made available on our website under our resources page. If you so happen to join us late or you'd like to share it with your colleagues, be sure and get a download there. And don't forget to sign up. Part 2 of our CISO series on building successful threat intelligence program will be on July 29th. And as Alan mentioned, that one will focus on starting a program. On Alan's screen, there's some contact information on how you can reach us via social. And in addition, there's our website is listed there. And you can also find recordings of our webcast through the BrightTalk platform itself. If you would like to reach us directly, either through the website or you can always email us, feel free to do that through sales@lookingglasscyber.com. And then also there's still there in the attachments links, our contact information. And thank you for all those questions that were submitted and everyone in our viewing audience today. And Alan, again, thank you for your time. And I think that's about a wrap for today's presentation. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I just want to say thank you very much for everybody's time, and I appreciate the opportunity to share our insights. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.